Hi, you're listening to Great Women in Compliance on the Compliance Podcast Network with Mary Shirley and Lisa Fine. I'm Lisa Fine, and today I am speaking with Jennifer Newton. Jennifer is an attorney at GreenbergTraurig. She's based in Miami and focuses on banking and financial institutions and risk management and on compliance matters. She's also one of the founders of the National Association of Black Compliance and Risk Management Professionals. This is a new organization, and it's starting out, and they're dedicated to the networking, promotion, and advancement of Black risk management professionals. From here on in, I'm going to call it NABCRMP, because those are the acronyms that they're going by. I am so pleased, Jennifer, that you're here to continue these important discussions that we're having right now about race in the ethics and compliance world, as well as learning about your career path and the road for you to become a financial risk and compliance professional. So with that in mind, thank you for being here. And Jennifer, can you tell us a bit about your background and how you got into compliance?
Perfect. And thank you so much, Lisa, for having me here today. I'm very excited to talk a little bit about my background and my experience and what we are doing at the National Association of Black Compliance and Risk Management Professionals. So the short-term name that we've come up with is NABCRMP, which we call it NABCRMP for now. So hopefully that's better in terms of discussion and talking about the organization. But a little bit about me. And so my pathway into compliance was somewhat unique in that I did not set out to go into the field of risk management and compliance when I graduated law school. So when I initially graduated law school, I worked for 5 years as a consumer protection attorney, where I was litigating cases in federal and state courts on behalf of consumer protection matters. I was also lobbying on the state level with regard to the Florida state legislature, and also writing and doing other advocacy work around consumer protection issues, specifically in the financial services space. And from there, that led me to end up at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, because at that time, the housing crisis had just exploded, and as most of you know, the story was that Congress decided to create this agency that would be dedicated to protecting consumers with regard to the financial abuses that they were seeing throughout the industry, and which somewhat led to the housing crisis. And so working as a regulatory attorney at the CFPB gave me a lot of insight into how regulations are promulgated by government agencies, and also from an enforcement perspective, how regulators view various issues with regard to enforcement, and then the steps that it takes to launch an investigation, and some of the items that regulators look to in terms of looking at potential enforcement and supervision matters. And so that gave me a really good grasp of the internal aspects of regulatory compliance from the government perspective. And from there, I was able to then land an opportunity to assist a very large financial service organization that was in the middle of trying to prepare for their CFPB examination, and also a number of other examinations at that time, because they were also subject to state regulatory enforcement action. But it was at that point that I learned, when I accepted the role of a regulatory compliance manager, that I really enjoyed the field of compliance, because I found that it was a way to combine my legal background, so my legal knowledge of rules and regulations, and my ability to interpret them and understand them from a legal perspective, with understanding what these organizations and specifically what my organization was attempting to do on the business side, and sort of meshing those those two together, and being able to help in a way that was much more rewarding, as opposed to just sort of providing legal advice on a regulation without really getting any hands-on experience or any specific interaction with those who are actually grappling with trying to implement the regulations. So I really found that work to be rewarding and to be a lot more useful in terms of the output that I was putting out. So other than just me providing legal opinions about what regulations mean, I was able to help the business in a way that is a lot different, in that I was able to help them build processes and systems around managing their regulatory expectations with compliance with regard to a regulation. So I really enjoyed that. And since then, I have sort of fluttered in this same space of being a regulatory advisor, where I'm advising specifically banking and financial institutions on regulatory compliance matters. And that's how I ended up in this field. And one of the things that has really jumped out to me is that as I entered into this field, I ran across many individuals like myself who were not necessarily in compliance-related roles, but they wanted to get into some of these same positions. And some of these folks were students. Some individuals were other professionals working in other industries. And I was always getting the same question, Lisa. And the question was, how did I get into my role? And so that question is that answer is not really nice and sweet. It's as I mentioned, a very a non-traditionary route. But I began to discover that there doesn't appear to be a clear pathway, and that the majority of people who get into the area of compliance, risk, or governance, they do so through their own paths and their own unique pathways that lead them into the area.
Yeah.
And mm-hmm. Go ahead, Lisa.
Oh, I was just going to say that is similar to my experience as well, and to many people. We all sort of come in thinking about, sort of drafted for a project. Not everybody, but many right now, although I think the profession is changing. It's almost like come in because you were drafted, stay because, there's so much you can do, and it's an interesting career path. But I think that is really, I was just going to say, I think that is a familiar experience. And one which you have identified, and also that I think with NABCRMP is kind of where you are, helping in that way too.
Right, exactly. And the other thing too is that I noticed, at least when I was in law school, and I don't know if that's changed at this point, but the law schools weren't necessarily touting these alternative roles where you can utilize your degree in a very fulfilling way in these other types of industries and areas. And so many people really don't know how to navigate themselves into this space. And unfortunately, what there's a saying, in the Black community, when the world catches colds, Black people catch pneumonia. And so that actually translates with regard to exclusion. And so if it's difficult for the average individual to break into the industry of compliance, it's probably going to be much more difficult for people of color to also navigate those channels. And so as I was heavily involved in regulatory compliance and getting involved in industry associations and networks, I was attending a lot of conferences, and I noticed that there weren't that many people of color, and then for the most part, while I would be able to connect with those who were attending the conferences, we would go away to our respective cities, and then that would be the end of the communication there. And so after discussing, some of the things that I was observing with a group of girlfriends that I have, and we tend to meet up and discuss about our professional development and things that we're working on in a way to support and encourage each other. That's where the idea of NABCRMP came up. And so initially the vision is to create a space and for professionals of color who are working in the risk management and the compliance space to be able to collaborate, network, share resources, and support each other, and to provide opportunities to those who are looking to break into the industry. And so that's really the genesis of how the organization got into its state of being.
That's great. I have a couple of follow-up questions too, because there's a lot there. But the first thing I wanted to ask about in terms of the networking and the building this, you also talk a lot about, from a risk and compliance standpoint, the importance of having a diverse room and the right people in the room. So I want to start a little bit about that, because I do think that the problems are barriers and other things that we can talk about later in trying to have networks, but also the idea that people may not everybody is thinking about in so many different ways about diversity, and particularly Blacks. I mean, I think, as you and I had talked about, and others, Mary and I have this particular platform. We feel very fortunate about it. We didn't know what would happen with it, but as an issue that we support, we also think it's really important, first that the right people get in the room and sort of the risk part about it. So let's start with risk and analysis and then talk a bit about diversity, inclusion, and networking. So with that, will you talk a little bit about that? So let's start with that. Does that work?
Sure, and that's actually a good starting point, because that's absolutely our core values in terms of what we are seeking to do. So at the heart of the organization, we believe that diversity and inclusion are critical aspects of effective risk governance. And what that means is that we believe that by supporting, encouraging, and fostering the professional development of Black compliance professionals and other professionals of color in these corporate environments, that would, as a result, encourage good corporate governance practices. And so when we talk about diversity and inclusion historically, I think one of the things that we are accustomed to doing is focusing on the intangibles, right? So we know that diversity and inclusion fosters team building. We know that it fosters good morale. We know that it fosters collaboration. But what we're trying to do, and at the core of the organization, so it's on one hand, we of course want to uplift and train and support Black compliance professionals who are in these spaces. But the underlining value and principle is it's by doing that, by supporting and nurturing these professionals, this would entail have the results of helping organizations to be able to have that diversity perspective, because it really is pertinent to effective decision making. So in the absence of having diversity at your decision level making levels, so that could be your executive team, that could be your board of directors, that could be those who are in management. But what we've observed through our own experiences is that the lack of having diverse professionals who can provide their unique perspectives, who can contribute and provide their point of reference in terms of a specific issue, is problematic to organizations who are now, and as a result of the way that the demographics in the nation are changing, but who now have a very diverse customer base. And it is no longer optional for organizations to engage in a decision-making, a process, or practices that do not encompass the perspectives of those who represent their constituencies or their customer base. So rather than discuss diversity and inclusion as talking points and as being important to the intangibles, we want to change the narrative as being a necessity, as being critical to risk governance, critical to corporations who are looking to foster good practices that have a good impact on communities. And so that's really at the heart of what we're seeking to do. So yes, we want to encourage, we want to inspire professionals of color to enter into these spaces and support them and uplift them, with the idea that doing so benefits everyone in the long term.
Absolutely. And I'm going to ask quickly a little bit about Black Lives Matter, and then it's going to tie back a bit, I think, to the NABCRMP's goals a little bit. But, you know, Black Lives Matter, to me, I think it's a unique moment in time, not that the issues are new, but right now there seems to be real momentum and recognition that change is critical, and it must be now since it wasn't yesterday as it should. Do you think also think it's a different time? And if so, you know, what do you think is most important, and this is a huge question, to continue forward progress, particularly in the ethics and compliance world, as well as just generally?
I do think that this is a different time. And I think that whereas, you know, a couple of months ago, we were not yet at the point where organizations and certain brands were willing to discuss diversity and inclusion and to be really intentional about an action plan and a response and a commitment to pushing those issues forward. And that is something that we haven't seen. So I will say in the past, we have not seen organizations willing to even state that Black Lives Matter. And so we've come a long way. And I think that this is a wonderful time to really push forward with you know, some of those commitments. It's important to harness this energy and this and I will say newfound commitment to really create a framework that is truly inclusive and truly reflective of an organization's customer base. And to do that, though, it does require intentionality, and it requires actions that have to be done at the internal level. And so I think that one of the things that we want to make sure is that the discussions continue on. So while we are seeing a lot of organizations putting out a lot of statements, a lot of commitments, and even a lot of funding. So there's a lot of funding going to certain organizations that are working on racial and social justice initiatives. That's wonderful. But in order to really move the needle forward, it requires transformative change internally, and that is why why we are seeking to enter into this space as an organization, to be able to help organizations identify action steps that will allow them to reach their diversity goals to the extent that is something that the organizations are truly committed to. But at the outset, it requires a commitment. It requires the buy-in of leadership. So leadership has to commit to wanting to create a much more diverse enterprise framework. And once that is done, then we can talk about what that looks like for the organization, because these are just terms, and it's important for everyone to have an agreement about what does the end goal look like? What does that mean for organizations when you say that you value diversity and inclusion? How does that look? And depending on that answer, that is going to drive the action item, and also the accountability frameworks that organizations would have to build in to achieve those metrics. And so so definitely, in order to keep that going, we would definitely have to do a lot more than just pronouncing our commitments or our stance against racism and bigotry. We need to take some serious action, and I think this is the time to do so. And simply because organizations at this point don't really have a choice. Now we have the Generation Zers and the millennials that don't necessarily judge organizations and companies by the quality of products anymore. So instead of judging organizations by those things, what's really important to them in terms of values is in organizations' ethics. So what they're doing in terms of their practices, what they're doing in terms of social impact, what are their policies? And those are some of the things that really resonate with this new generation. And with social media available for the world to see, organizations would face a significant risk with not really responding to that sense of values with this new constituency. And so it is now incumbent for organizations to take the steps to really identify what it truly would mean to be an inclusive organization that values diversity, that is open and provides opportunity for everybody.
Right. And one of the things about the statements and the support, which is all, the right thing to do, I think social media does a lot of that, but it is really a question of what are you doing behind that? Are you going, are you actually doing the work for your organization to not just increase hiring, but to actually, take barriers away from people of color, to provide opportunities to be able to look from one part of a function to another and say, oh, that's, a promising person, and help those pipelines. One of the things I think about a lot, and I'm struggling with is, okay, there are the words right now, because this is the moment for the words, but are some of these large companies, looking at this genuinely, or because they think this is how you're supposed to do it? So, what do you think we need to see next, if you agree with that? If not, let me know. I mean, that's just sort of my biggest concern is everyone's saying these things, but are they going to act?
No, absolutely. And I think that you will, I absolutely agree with you, Lisa. I think that now, I think people are beyond performative gestures. They're beyond social media posts, and what it seems that the call to action is now is what are you going to do to advance the call to action forward, and discussions and promises and statements are not going to do that in and of themselves. And I think there is growing pressure for organizations not to simply just get away with being performative. I think that there will be, and rightly so, a pressure to look at what organizations have done, who have stated these commitments, who have put themselves out there as being an organization that is committed to diversity and inclusion. And so it's going to be a lot more pressure than just saying the words that Black Lives Matters. We get that, and we appreciate that statement and that commitment. But I think that now what the call to action is what are we going to do internally? What are you going to what action steps are you going to take to transform or to create more diversity and inclusion in your organization? And I don't think that organizations are going to get away with simply just making the statements, or in the alternative, just paying funds or donations to charitable organizations, because at the end of the day, the call to action is diversity and inclusion at your organization. So while it's great to support social justice organizations that are working to increase racial and ethnic inclusion, the concern is on the organization's own actions and what are you doing to advance that forward. And I think that at this point, because there's a lot at stake in terms of the way that marginalized people feel, especially with things happening involving police brutality and people being killed. I think there's a lot of people that are feeling that, in terms of gestures, those are no longer acceptable, and they want to see real change, because the same way that individuals face potential harassment or feeling that they're being policed or they're feeling that they have just someone on their neck. It's the same way that people feel, especially marginalized people of color, feel in some of these corporations, that they are not able to be mobile, to move within the organization, that there's always a roadblock. And so that's the call to action for organizations. That is their sphere of influence that they can change. And so the racial and the social justice organizations, they will do their part. But I think organizations have their own decisions and their own action steps that they can take internally to change their own sphere of influence.
One of the things, I was looking at LinkedIn at one point, and you can see one of the places out there that there are the most job opportunities right now is there seems to be a number of companies that say, oh, well, we need someone to run a diversity and inclusion program. My hope is, I know that that's a great step, but those individuals, who's ever hired for those roles, are also given the tools and opportunities to succeed, to help remove barriers, mentor, sponsor, advocate, any and all of those terms, and to help their organizations do exactly what you're saying, their own version of organizational and social justice internally. So, I think that it's important that not just the organization is diverse, but that leadership is diverse, so that the people, so that people have opportunities. Women, lots of women have those concerns, but it's with marginalized groups, it's even more significant. So, one of the things is to talk to us, how can we be better, be better supporters and allies of those goals?
Right. No, that's a great question. And to go back to something you just said about the diversity and inclusion positions that are opening up, those are great, and those are a great first step. But as you mentioned, the individuals who take on those positions have to be empowered by leadership, and there has to be a commitment at the top. So the same way when we talk about compliance, we always say, it starts from the top, starts from your board of directors, right? So the board of directors have to buy into to whatever the organization is seeking to comply with. And so if diversity and inclusion is seen as, no longer something that's a nice thing to have, but a necessity similar to complying with a regulation, then that's something that needs the same support that the executive team, the board of directors would give in any other context with regard to a compliance metric that's critical to the organization. But in terms of that question about supporting professionals of color who are in these spaces and who are looking for opportunities the same way that everyone else is, I think one of the biggest ways that organizations and allies can support people of color is by creating a way to make sure that there is always somebody in the room. So I think sometimes when there are a group of people who are all the same and who come from the same backgrounds, it's easy to forget that there is there's a lack of diversity here. And so being really cognizant about that, so being really conscious and intentional to be inclusive goes a long way for individuals who are sometimes the only one in their organization. So that's also helpful, making sure that they're getting the same resources, the same support that other employees get, and even if not more, making sure that they have an opportunity to showcase their talents, their skills, making sure that their voices are heard. So those kinds of things go a long way in supporting and helping organizations reach their diversity benchmarks. And that's one of the ways that I think that allies who are looking to be supportive and to be, effective, is really to do what you can do in your own sphere of influence. So if you know that you know someone who is diverse, who is talented, who would be a great person to add to the team, it's as easy as encouraging the recruiters to give some consideration to this person in terms of advancing within the organization. It could be as simple as advocating for persons of color who are deserving and have the skill sets for the positions. So it takes being really intentional and conscious and aware of the environment, because it's easy to default to business as usual, and sometimes we forget. It's easy to forget about how various issues and systems and structures affect those who are not a part of our own individual groups or what we classify as. So it's being, and I would say that that's one of the things that allies can do, is be intentional, be conscious, be aware, and get involved and speak up, because that's the other thing too. There's more power in numbers, and the more other people get involved and speak up against issues that have negative impacts on people of color, the better we all are. And so and then it would seem that we're all asking for the same thing, and that's a demand that leadership can't ignore when it's coming from the team.
I also think, you can tell me your thought on this as well. I think often many of us feel a sense of otherness for ourselves, the only woman, the only person from Latam, when you're on a board of all Europeans. I think one of the things that I've thought a lot about lately is that there's a bigger systemic issue than some of these individual concerns, and it's time to for us, when we're trying to be better allies, is to look past our own moment of quote otherness to realize sort of the bigger picture that's out there, both within our organization and externally in the compliance and risk communities as a whole. And that's one of the it's a work in progress for many people. I mean, if I'm the only woman in a room of 10 men who are older and senior and been there for a long time, you're thinking about that. But the idea is, it's still, the room is not inclusive at all. Even with me there, it needs to be better. And I think many women have had that experience of all colors being, but I think it's really, really important. And so my other question response to that is, within the compliance community as a whole, hopefully those of us who are in it can help to be more inclusive, not just within our organizations, but within this community, because I think it's a unique community that tries very hard to help anybody who wants to be a part of it and make organizations and things better.
Absolutely. And also too, we more than anybody, we understand risk. We understand potential negative outcomes. We understand what happens when organizations don't embrace things that should be included in a corporate environment. We understand that more than anybody, and so we more than anybody should be advocates for the organizations to embrace programs and initiatives that would be beneficial to the organization and to the longevity of the company. That should be our goal as compliance officers, as risk officers, That is, not having diversity poses a risk to the organization. And it's very important for us as compliance officers and risk advisors to understand that. So rather than focus solely on laws and regulations and the day-to-day minutia that organizations are subject to, we should keep in mind that there are other risks, and it could be risk to, of course, to team building, collaboration, but also risk to the organization in terms of creating blind spots and creating a lack of inclusion. I think of the examples of organizations that have done certain things, and you have to wonder, how did that, who made that decision, and how could they have thought, that releasing that shirt or doing that commercial or making those statements would not offend, the majority of their customer base. And that either tells me a couple of things. It either tells me that, one, they're not diverse individuals who would have probably understood those issues immediately, right away, those implications and those risks right away, are not in the room, or it's either that they are in the room and they're not being heard. But something's happening there. And it's important now than ever, like I said, because this generation is a generation of values, and what resonates for them is not so much the quality of products, but a company's ethics, what they're doing in terms of their practices, what's their social impact, how inclusive are they? And so those are some key considerations that organizations need to take into account as they are building their enterprise risk framework to manage risk, because the failure to be inclusive poses severe reputational risk, financial risk, a whole host of risk. So, the same way that we take steps and we develop frameworks and processes to manage our day-to-day risk, we need to take measures and incorporate systems and processes to ensure that diversity and inclusion is not a blind spot in the organization, and that individuals, everyone of every shade and background, are being included and valued in discussions.
Yeah. And I think it's a great point for us to end on. And I just want to say how thrilled I am to have had the opportunity to speak with you about this and to be able to help support you all as you go forward, both within Mary or me, or if we, or within this larger community of people that are a pretty diverse group that listen to the podcast and also are part of the LinkedIn community. And as you're building that network, for whatever we can keep doing to be supportive and to be good allies. I know many of us are working to educate ourselves, but hopefully we can help you grow and build this amazing thing that you started. And with that, I just want to say thank you so much. And then on behalf of Mary and me and the Compliance Podcast Network, thanks so much for joining.
Oh, thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you, Mary. And I really, really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to speak about these very, very important issues.